When the Romans crucified Jesus of Nazareth, imperial logic suggested his movement would die with him. Cut off the head, and the body perishes. Instead, an uncredentialed group of fishermen and craftsmen began spreading his teachings faster than ever. The epicenter of this initial collision was Jerusalem. The tight, ancient streets of the city became a pressure cooker, pitting the rapidly multiplying numbers of new believers against a deeply entrenched religious authority. The ruling class decided to repeat their earlier tactic. They calculated that if they swiftly eliminated the loudest, most visible leaders of this new sect, the crowds would scatter and the disruption would end. That localized decapitation strategy backfired. By making Jerusalem too dangerous for residents, the authorities forced the surviving disciples to flee, turning a regional Judean sect into a global threat. The violence started immediately. Stephen, a prominent early believer, was dragged outside the city gates and stoned to death. Shortly after, James, one of the original 12 apostles, was arrested and beheaded by sword. Then the authorities made a public spectacle of a church leader known as James the Lesser. They pushed him off the highest pinnacle of the temple, and when the massive drop didn't kill him, an assailant finished the job with a heavy club in the dust. These men walked into their executions with their eyes open, a stark contrast to the fate of Judas Iscariot. Judas had sold out his teacher for 30 pieces of silver, but rather than dying for his convictions, he was crushed by guilt and took his own life. To keep the group whole, the remaining disciples replaced Judas with a man named Matthias. Matthias took up the mantle and began preaching in the streets, a decision that eventually cost him his life through public stoning and decapitation. The concentration of blood on the paving stones made one thing clear: Jerusalem was no longer a sanctuary. If the remaining apostles wanted to stay alive long enough to preach their message, they had to cross the borders into the wider ancient world. Entering the Roman Empire meant stepping into a structured ideological trap. Roman governors viewed preaching allegiance to a new divine king as an act of treason against Caesar. The empire's response was brutal. During Emperor Nero's purges, Peter, the leader of the apostles, was arrested in Rome. On Vatican Hill, he was sentenced to die by crucifixion. Believing he was unworthy to die as his teacher did, Peter made one final, unexpected request to his executioners. He asked to be nailed to the cross upside down. Paul, another major architect of the church, met his end around the same time. His Roman citizenship spared him the slow torture of the cross. Instead, he was marched out through the heavy stone gates of the Via Ostiense to a secluded spot and beheaded. The violence echoed across the Greek provinces. In Patras, Andrew was bound with ropes to an X-shaped cross, hanging alive for 2 full days. Further east, in the city of Hierapolis, Philip faced public execution for converting the wife of a Roman official. The Roman strategy of public humiliation failed. By elevating these men on crosses and scaffolds, the empire handed the apostles a literal raised platform to preach their message until their final breath. This map shows how far the remaining disciples traveled to escape the imperial centers. They pushed past familiar territory and walked into unmapped, hostile pagan frontiers, where local priests viewed them as existential threats to their idols. In Persia, Simon the Zealot and Jude Thaddeus drew the anger of local authorities. Both were arrested and subjected to violence, including beatings with iron clubs, being sawn in half, and beheading. Matthew, the former tax collector, took his ministry south into the African continent. His journey ended deep in Ethiopia, where local leaders surrounded him and stabbed him with a sword in the middle of a church gathering. The distances they cover are staggering. Thomas traveled all the way to India, where he was ambushed and pierced with spears. In Armenia, Bartholomew suffered the most agonizing death of all, flayed alive and stripped of his skin by pagan priests who wanted to erase his physical legacy. Across thousands of miles, isolated from one another and facing unimaginable torture, not a single one of these men recanted. Amidst this history of slaughter, there is one anomaly. The Apostle John, the youngest of the original 12, outlived them all, watching his missionary brothers fall one by one until he was the only remaining witness. The Roman Empire did try to kill him. Under Emperor Domitian, John was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil in Rome, but he stepped from that cauldron unharmed. Fearing that his survival might be interpreted as a divine sign, the empire exiled him to Patmos, a desolate island of rock isolated in the sea. That isolation gave John exactly what he needed. Alone on the wind-swept cliffs, he received a series of vivid visions, penned the book of Revelation, and wrote letters that would guide the early churches. He eventually died of old age. By leaving John alive to rot in the Aegean Sea, the empire made a tactical error. They inadvertently handed the last living apostle the quiet isolation required to permanently record the final theological texts of the Christian faith. Ancient authorities operated on a simple assumption: if you kill the leadership, the movement dies with them. They overlooked a critical psychological reality. The apostles' willingness to endure slaughter proved to the ancient world that their message was a certainty, not a grift. People do not surrender themselves to be flayed alive for a lie. The execution sites of these men transformed into thriving cultural epicenters, and ancient pilgrimage routes still walked by millions today. The spot where James's body was supposedly buried in Spain birthed the Camino de Santiago, a physical footprint that has endured for centuries. The brutal execution of these 12 men did not erase them from history. Instead, their spilled blood drew the borders of a faith that outlasted the Roman Empire and crossed the globe.